The Black Ancestry Network group was made aware of an online artificial intelligence website at chat.openai.com. During the course of researching the Exodus Equation series, which is due to be uploaded in early September, the B.A.N.G decided to see how this artificial intelligence would respond to questions related to Scripture. In particular, with some of the subject matter that is brought up by many, if not all, of the Hebrew Israelites. The B.A.N.G simply wanted to ask questions related to the transatlantic slave trade and its relevance to Scripture. You might want to hold on to your butts on this one. The conversation takes place on July 23, 2023. There is an eye-opener at the back end. Okay, let's get to it. What books do you have in your databank that were written by Europeans who believed that the Jews/Hebrews were in North America?
As an AI language model, I don't have direct access to my training data or know where it came from. However, I was trained on a mixture of licensed data, data created by human trainers, and publicly available data. OpenAI, the organization behind my development, has not publicly disclosed the specifics of the individual datasets used, including whether specific books or authors were included in the training data. It's essential to note that the belief that Jews or Hebrews were present in North America before the arrival of Europeans is not supported by mainstream historical and archaeological evidence. Claims of pre-Columbian Jewish presence in the Americas are generally considered to be part of various pseudo-historical or fringe theories. These ideas have been widely debunked and are not part of mainstream scholarship. If you are interested in learning more about the history of Jewish migration and presence in North America, I recommend looking into reputable historical sources and academic works that are based on evidence and supported by the scholarly community.
Where in the Bible can you find prophecies related to a worldwide captivity?
In the Bible, prophecies related to a worldwide captivity can be found in various passages, particularly in the Old Testament. One such prominent prophecy is in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28. This chapter contains blessings and curses that the Israelites were told would befall them depending on their obedience or disobedience to God's commandments. Deuteronomy 28 verses 64 to 68, New International Version, contains a specific prophecy of a worldwide captivity. Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations, from one end of the earth to the other. There you will worship other gods, gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your ancestors have known. Among those nations, you will find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. There the Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of your life. In the morning, you will say, if only it were evening, and in the evening, if only it were morning. Because of the terror that will fill your hearts and the sights that your eyes will see. The Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt on a journey I said you should never make again. There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. This prophecy was fulfilled in history during the Babylonian and Roman exiles, where the Jewish people were dispersed and experienced captivity in various parts of the world. Throughout history, Jewish communities have faced diaspora and persecution, fulfilling the prophecy of being scattered among the nations.
Use bullet points to show me the specific captivities mentioned in your last response.
Sure. Here are the specific captivities mentioned in the prophecy from Deuteronomy 28 verses 64 to 68. The Lord will scatter you among all nations, from one end of the earth to the other. Among those nations, you will find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. The Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of your life. In the morning, you will say, if only it were evening. And in the evening, if only it were morning. Because of the terror that will fill your hearts and the sights that your eyes will see. The Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt on a journey I said you should never make again. There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you.
Can you identify a certain demographic of people who were scattered among the nations?
Yes. The prophecy from Deuteronomy 28 verses 64 to 68 refers to the Israelites, who were a specific demographic of people that were warned about the consequences of disobedience to God's commandments. According to the Bible, the Israelites were the descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob, who was later named Israel, and they formed the tribes of Israel. Throughout their history, they faced various periods of captivity, exile, and dispersion among different nations due to their disobedience and failure to uphold their covenant with God. This dispersion is known as the Jewish diaspora. Over the centuries, Jewish communities have been scattered throughout the world, experiencing various forms of captivity and exile, fulfilling the prophecy in this biblical passage.
Are there people on the earth today who have suffered a historical worldwide captivity?
As of my last update in September 2021, there is no evidence or historical record of any specific group of people who have experienced a worldwide captivity on a global scale similar to the prophecy mentioned in Deuteronomy 28 verses 64 to 68. While certain populations have faced widespread dispersion or forced migrations due to conflicts, wars, colonization, or other historical events, there is no documented instance of a global captivity affecting all people worldwide. The Bible's prophecy in Deuteronomy is a specific religious text and should be understood in its historical and religious context. Throughout history, various groups have faced significant hardships, forced migrations, and persecution, but these events have been regional or limited to specific areas rather than affecting all people globally. It is essential to rely on historical records, academic research, and reputable sources to understand the experiences of different communities throughout history accurately. The study of history helps us gain insight into the diverse and complex experiences of humanity over time.
Was the transatlantic slave trade a worldwide captivity?
The transatlantic slave trade was a significant historical event that involved the forced transportation of millions of African people to the Americas as slaves. While it was a vast and tragic system of forced labor and captivity that affected millions of individuals, it was not a worldwide captivity in the sense of the prophecy mentioned in Deuteronomy 28 verses 64 to 68. The transatlantic slave trade primarily involved the enslavement of African people and their transportation across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, particularly to regions like North America, the Caribbean, and South America. It was a brutal and inhumane system that lasted for several centuries, from the 16th to the 19th centuries. However, it was geographically limited to specific regions and not a global captivity affecting all people worldwide. While the impact of the transatlantic slave trade was profound and had long-lasting consequences for the African diaspora and the Americas, it is important to distinguish it from the concept of a worldwide captivity mentioned in the biblical prophecy.
The transatlantic slave trade existed in Portugal, British West Indies, Spanish Empire, the French West Indies, English/British North America/the United States, Dutch West Indies, and Danish West Indies. Historically, is there a larger-scale captivity recorded?
The transatlantic slave trade was undoubtedly one of the most extensive and devastating forms of captivity recorded in history. It affected millions of Africans who were forcibly enslaved and transported to various regions, including those you mentioned: Portugal, British West Indies, Spanish Empire, French West Indies, English/British North America/the United States, Dutch West Indies, and Danish West Indies. The scale of the transatlantic slave trade was immense, lasting for several centuries from the 16th to the 19th centuries. It involved not only the transport of enslaved individuals but also the establishment of a complex system of labor exploitation, brutal treatment, and human suffering. Countless lives were lost during the Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic, due to harsh conditions, disease, and abuse. While the transatlantic slave trade was one of the largest and most impactful instances of captivity in recorded history, it is essential to recognize that various forms of forced labor, captivity, and enslavement have existed in different societies and periods throughout history. Other examples include slavery in ancient civilizations. Slavery was widespread in ancient civilizations, such as ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The Arab slave trade. The Arab slave trade was a significant historical phenomenon that involved the capture and enslavement of Africans and their transport to various regions of the Middle East and North Africa. Serfdom in medieval Europe. During the Middle Ages, serfdom was a form of forced labor where peasants were tied to the land and subject to the control of feudal lords. Indigenous enslavement. In some regions, indigenous populations were enslaved and exploited by European colonizers and other conquerors. It is crucial to study and acknowledge the various forms of historical captivity and forced labor to understand the complexities and impact of these practices on human societies and to ensure that we learn from the past to build a more just and equitable future.
Can the African slave trade be compared to any other captivity in world history with respect to the number of people affected or enslaved?
The transatlantic slave trade, which involved the forced transportation of millions of African people to the Americas as slaves, stands out as one of the largest and most devastating instances of captivity and forced labor in world history. Its scale and impact on the African continent and the Americas are unparalleled when compared to other historical instances of captivity. When considering the number of people affected and enslaved, it is challenging to find an exact comparison in history due to the immense scope of the transatlantic slave trade. Estimates vary, but it is believed that between 12 to 12.8 million Africans were forcibly transported as slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Tragically, millions of others lost their lives during the brutal capture, transportation, and forced labor. The scale of the transatlantic slave trade dwarfs most other known instances of captivity or forced labor in history. While there have been other systems of slavery and forced labor in different regions and time periods, such as ancient slavery in Greece and Rome, the Arab slave trade, or various forms of serfdom, none of them involve such an extensive and concentrated mass enslavement on a global scale like the transatlantic slave trade. It is essential to remember that each historical instance of captivity and forced labor carries its own unique horrors and consequences for the people affected. While we can learn from history to avoid repeating such atrocities, it is essential to acknowledge the distinctiveness and magnitude of the transatlantic slave trade and its impact on millions of African lives and the shaping of societies in the Americas.
With that in mind, at this present time in history, would you agree that the transatlantic slave trade is the only captivity that can be considered to be the fulfillment of promised captivities written within the Bible?
As an AI language model, I don't have personal opinions or beliefs. However, I can provide an analysis based on the information available up to my last update in September 2021. The transatlantic slave trade, with its vast scale and impact, is a significant historical event that involved the forced captivity and enslavement of millions of Africans, leading to immeasurable suffering and long-lasting consequences. It was a deeply tragic and inhumane system, and its historical significance cannot be understated. Regarding the fulfillment of specific prophecies written within the Bible, interpretations of biblical texts can vary widely among different religious traditions and scholars. The prophecy in Deuteronomy 28 verses 64 to 68, which speaks of a worldwide captivity, is one of the verses that some have connected to the historical experiences of the Jewish people, particularly during their exiles and the Jewish diaspora. It is essential to approach biblical texts with sensitivity to religious beliefs and scholarly perspectives. Interpretations of prophecies and their fulfillment can be complex and multifaceted, and there is often ongoing debate and discussion among theologians, historians, and scholars. While the transatlantic slave trade represents an unparalleled instance of captivity and suffering in history, its connection to specific biblical prophecies and their fulfillment remains a matter of interpretation and belief. It is essential to consider historical evidence, academic research, and multiple perspectives when exploring such topics.
With respect to Deuteronomy chapter 28, can you break down verse 68 with Strong's Concordance understanding of the words?
Sure, let's break down Deuteronomy 28 verse 68 and examine the verse with the help of Strong's Concordance to understand the original Hebrew words used in the text. Deuteronomy 28 verse 68, New International Version. The Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt on a journey I said you should never make again. There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. Now, let's break down some of the key Hebrew words in this verse using Strong's Concordance. Ships, the Hebrew word is pronounced oni. It refers to large vessels or ships used for transportation. Egypt, the Hebrew word is pronounced Mitzrayim. It refers to the land of Egypt. Journey, the Hebrew word is pronounced derek. It signifies a way or a road, often used to represent a journey or travel. Offer yourselves for sale, the Hebrew phrase is pronounced venom cardum shamliavica. It means to be sold or given for sale to one's enemies. Slaves, the Hebrew word is pronounced eved. It refers to a servant or a slave, one who is in a position of subordination to another. No one will buy you, the Hebrew phrase is pronounced V-E-I-N konolakum. This phrase emphasizes that there will be no buyers or redeemers for the enslaved people, implying a situation of desperation and rejection. In this verse, the Lord is warning the Israelites of the consequences of disobedience to His commandments. He states that they will be taken back to Egypt in ships, a journey that they were forbidden to make again. In Egypt, they would offer themselves for sale as male and female slaves to their enemies, but despite their attempts to be sold, no one will buy them, indicating a situation of utter despair and rejection. It is important to note that interpretations of biblical verses can vary among different religious traditions and scholars, and Strong's Concordance provides insights into the original Hebrew words used in the text for a deeper understanding of the scripture.
What is the largest captivity of slaves in all of world history that involved ships?
The largest captivity of slaves in all of world history that involved ships is undoubtedly the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was a massive and organized system of forced transportation of African people across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas as slaves. It took place over several centuries, from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Estimates vary, but it is believed that between 12 to 12.8 million Africans were forcibly transported as slaves to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. This tragic and inhumane system involved large ships known as slave ships, which were specifically designed to carry as many enslaved individuals as possible under horrific and degrading conditions. The transatlantic slave trade was driven by European colonial powers and involved the capture, sale, and transportation of Africans from various regions of the African continent to labor on plantations in the Americas, particularly in regions like North America, the Caribbean, and South America. This brutal system of forced labor and captivity had a profound and long-lasting impact on African societies and the development of the Americas, leaving a legacy of suffering, exploitation, and racial injustice that continues to be felt to this day. It remains one of the darkest chapters in human history and serves as a stark reminder of the atrocities that can be committed when greed, racism, and power intersect.
Is there any other captivity of slaves transported with ships in all of world history?
Yes, there have been other instances of captivity and forced transportation of slaves by ships in world history, although none reached the scale of the transatlantic slave trade. Here are a few notable examples. Arab slave trade. The Arab slave trade involved the capture and transportation of African slaves to the Middle East and North Africa. It predates the transatlantic slave trade and continued for centuries. While estimates vary, it is believed to have affected millions of Africans. Indian Ocean slave trade. This slave trade network operated between East Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean region. It involved the enslavement and transportation of Africans and people from other regions, such as the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. East African slave trade. This trade network involved the enslavement and transportation of Africans from East Africa, particularly from regions like present-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Slavery in the Mediterranean. In ancient times, slavery was widespread in the Mediterranean region, with slaves being transported by ships across the sea. Slavery in the Americas. Other than transatlantic, there were instances of slavery in the Americas outside of the transatlantic slave trade. For example, there were indigenous peoples who were enslaved and transported within the Americas by European colonizers. While these examples represent significant instances of slavery and forced transportation by ships, none of them reach the massive scale and intensity of the transatlantic slave trade, which remains the largest and most impactful historical event involving the transportation of slaves by ships on a global scale.
What is the common denominator in points 1, 2, and 3? And do points 3 and 4 rise to the levels of the transatlantic slave trade?
The common denominator in points 1, 2, and 3 is the transportation of slaves by ships. In all these instances, enslaved individuals were captured or traded, and then transported across bodies of water to different regions for forced labor and exploitation. Now, let's address points 3 and 4 in relation to the transatlantic slave trade. East African slave trade. The East African slave trade was a significant regional trade network that involved the capture and enslavement of Africans from East Africa and their transportation to the Middle East, India, and other parts of the Indian Ocean region. While the East African slave trade had a substantial impact on the affected populations and caused immense suffering, it did not reach the same scale as the transatlantic slave trade in terms of the number of enslaved individuals transported or the geographic extent of the trade. Slavery in the Americas. Other than transatlantic slavery in the Americas outside of the transatlantic slave trade included the enslavement of indigenous peoples and some smaller-scale instances of forced transportation of slaves within the Americas. While these instances of slavery caused significant harm and suffering to the affected communities, they did not rise to the same levels as the transatlantic slave trade in terms of the sheer number of enslaved individuals transported or the organized, global system of forced labor that characterized the transatlantic slave trade. In summary, while there were other instances of slavery and forced transportation of slaves by ships in history, such as those mentioned in points 3 and 4, none of them reached the same scale and impact as the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was a massive and organized system that forcibly transported millions of African slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, making it the largest and most devastating instance of slavery and forced labor in world history.
With regard to the word kingdom as a noun, how many kingdoms existed during the period of the transatlantic slave trade?
During the period of the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from the 16th to the 19th centuries, there were numerous kingdoms and monarchies across different regions of the world. It's important to note that the transatlantic slave trade involved multiple European colonial powers and African states, each with their own political structures and forms of governance. In Africa, various African kingdoms and empires played roles in the slave trade, as some African leaders and elites were involved in capturing and selling enslaved individuals to European slave traders. Some of the African kingdoms that participated in the slave trade include Kingdom of Dahomey, present-day Benin; Ashanti Empire, present-day Ghana; Kingdom of Congo, present-day Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola; Oyo Empire, present-day Nigeria; Benin Empire, present-day Nigeria. In the Americas, the European colonial powers established their own kingdoms and territories. For example, Portuguese Empire, with territories in Brazil; Spanish Empire, with territories in the Caribbean and South America; British Empire, with territories in North America, the Caribbean, and parts of South America; French Empire, with territories in the Caribbean and North America. These are just a few examples, and there were many more kingdoms, empires, and colonial powers involved in the transatlantic slave trade. The trade itself had a profound impact on the political, social, and economic structures of the regions involved, shaping the course of history in both the Americas and Africa.
Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 25. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. How would you break this verse down?
Deuteronomy 28 verse 25 is another verse from the same chapter that contains prophecies related to the consequences of disobedience to God's commandments. In this verse, the Lord warns of the punishment that will befall the disobedient. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. Here's a breakdown of the key elements in this verse. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. The Lord is warning that the people will face military defeat and be struck down by their enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them. The people will experience defeat in battle, trying to confront their enemies but ultimately fleeing in multiple directions due to their inability to stand against them. Shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. As a consequence of their disobedience, the people will be scattered and exiled to various kingdoms or nations across the earth. This verse is part of the broader context of the blessings and curses outlined in Deuteronomy 28, where God presents the Israelites with the rewards for obedience and the punishments for disobedience to the covenant. The mention of being removed into all the kingdoms of the earth emphasizes the severity of the consequences, indicating widespread dispersion and exile among different nations.
Deuteronomy, chapter 28, Verse 32. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look, and fail, with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand.
Deuteronomy 28 verse 32 is another verse from the same chapter, which continues to describe the consequences of disobedience to God's commandments. In this verse, the Lord warns of the tragic fate that will befall the disobedient. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look, and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. Here's a breakdown of the key elements in this verse. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people. As a punishment for their disobedience, the children of the disobedient people will be taken away from them and given to another people. This likely refers to the practice of slavery or forced labor, where families were torn apart and children were separated from their parents. Thine eyes shall look, and fail with longing for them all the day long. The parents will be filled with sorrow and longing for their children, but they will be unable to do anything to reunite with them. There shall be no might in thine hand. The people will lack the power or ability to prevent the separation of their families or to resist the forces that have taken their children away. This verse is a somber depiction of the devastating impact of disobedience to God's commandments. It portrays a situation where families are torn apart and parents are left powerless and filled with grief due to their inability to protect their children. It serves as a warning of the severe consequences that would befall the people if they turned away from the path of obedience and righteousness.
Deuteronomy 28 verse 25 and verse 32 are identifiers. What are the similarities between these chapters and the transatlantic slave trade?
Deuteronomy 28 verse 25 and verse 32, as part of the broader chapter of Deuteronomy 28, contain prophecies of the consequences of disobedience to God's commandments. While these verses were originally addressed to the ancient Israelites, some parallels can be drawn between the descriptions in these verses and the experiences of African people during the transatlantic slave trade. Military defeat and removal. Deuteronomy 28 verse 25 mentions that disobedient people would face defeat in battle before their enemies and be removed to all the kingdoms of the earth. During the transatlantic slave trade, many African communities faced violent raids, warfare, and conquest by European slave traders and colonial powers. African individuals were forcibly taken from their homelands and transported across the Atlantic to be enslaved in various regions, including the Americas. Separation of families. Deuteronomy 28 verse 32 prophesies that the children of disobedient people would be taken away and given to another people, and the parents would be left longing for them with no power to reunite. Similarly, during the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans endured the heart-wrenching experience of being separated from their families. Slave traders often sold family members to different slave owners, causing immense emotional distress and suffering. Powerlessness and oppression. Both Deuteronomy 28 verse 25 and verse 32 depict a situation where the disobedient people would have no might or power in their hands. Similarly, during the transatlantic slave trade, Africans were subjected to extreme powerlessness and oppression. Enslaved individuals were treated as property and had no legal rights, facing brutal and inhumane treatment at the hands of their owners and overseers. Longing and grief. Deuteronomy 28 verse 32 mentions the longing and grief the parents would experience for their children. Similarly, during the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved individuals experienced profound grief and sorrow over the loss of their freedom, homeland, and family connections. The longing for freedom and the desire to be reunited with loved ones were recurring themes in the narratives of enslaved Africans. It's essential to acknowledge that the transatlantic slave trade was a complex historical event with many dimensions, and drawing parallels to specific biblical prophecies should be done with sensitivity and care. While there are some similarities between certain aspects of Deuteronomy 28 and the transatlantic slave trade, it is crucial to recognize the historical context and unique aspects of both narratives. The transatlantic slave trade remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, and it is essential to remember the immense suffering endured by enslaved Africans and the lasting impact on their descendants and on the world.
I am searching for the lost tribes of Israel and the historical facts related to their history. There are no other people on the planet or in world history that could have fulfilled the previously mentioned verses or the entirety of chapter 28 in the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, The transatlantic slave trade is the only comparable historical event to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, are you familiar with D.A.N.G versus the Papal Bull of Pope Nicholas V?
As an AI language model, I don't have personal beliefs or opinions, but I can provide information based on historical knowledge up to my last update in September 2021. Regarding the search for the lost tribes of Israel, it's essential to recognize that historical research and biblical interpretations can be complex and sometimes contentious. The idea of the lost tribes of Israel refers to the tribes of Israel that were said to have been lost or dispersed after the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests of the ancient kingdom of Israel. Over the centuries, various theories and claims have emerged about the potential whereabouts of these lost tribes, but there is no consensus among scholars or historical evidence to conclusively identify their precise locations. As for the comparisons between the prophecies in Deuteronomy 28 and historical events, it's important to approach such discussions with academic rigor and respect for diverse perspectives. While some individuals and groups have drawn connections between certain biblical prophecies and historical events like the transatlantic slave trade, these interpretations can be subject to debate and different interpretations among scholars and religious communities. Regarding D.A.N.G verses, it was a papal bull issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452. The bull granted permission to the Portuguese to conquer and subjugate Saracens, Muslims, pagans, and other unbelievers and to claim their lands and properties. This papal bull was one of several issued during the era of European exploration and colonial expansion, and it played a role in justifying European colonization and the conquest of non-Christian territories. The historical events related to the transatlantic slave trade and the broader context of European colonialism are complex and carry significant moral and ethical implications. It's crucial to approach the study of history with a critical and nuanced perspective, acknowledging the diverse experiences and narratives of different communities impacted by these events. Additionally, it's important to rely on well-established historical research and reputable sources to gain a comprehensive understanding of these topics.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Now let's continue. Would it be correct to say that the Christian Crusades and the D.A.N.G versus laws were enacted during the same period in time?
Yes, it would be correct to say that the Christian Crusades and the issuance of the papal bull D.A.N.G verses occurred during the same period of time. The Christian Crusades were a series of religious military campaigns sanctioned by the Latin Roman Catholic Church in the medieval period. They were launched with the aim of regaining control of holy sites in the eastern Mediterranean, particularly Jerusalem, from Muslim rulers. The First Crusade began in 1096, and subsequent crusades took place intermittently over several centuries. The papal bull D.A.N.G verses was issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452, which was several centuries after the start of the Christian Crusades. This papal bull granted the Portuguese monarch the authority to conquer and subjugate non-Christian territories, including Muslims and pagans, and to claim their lands and properties. D.A.N.G verses was part of a series of papal bulls and declarations issued during the era of European exploration and colonial expansion. Both the Christian Crusades and the issuance of D.A.N.G verses were rooted in the context of medieval Europe's religious and political dynamics. The Crusades sought to establish Christian control over key religious sites, whereas D.A.N.G verses and similar papal bulls aimed to justify and legitimize European exploration, colonization, and expansion into non-Christian territories. These events are significant in understanding the historical interactions between Christian Europe and other religious and cultural communities during the medieval and early modern periods. They reflect the complex and often conflicting dynamics between religion, power, and territorial expansion during that time.
Let me draw your attention to the book of Psalms chapter 83. Can you break that down using Strong's understanding of key words in this chapter?
Certainly. Let's break down Psalm 83 using Strong's Concordance to understand the meanings of keywords in this chapter. Psalm 83, New International Version. O God, do not remain silent, do not turn a deaf ear, do not stand aloof, O God. See how your enemies growl, how your foes rear their heads. With cunning they conspire against your people, they plot against those you cherish. Come, they say, let us destroy them as a nation so that Israel's name is remembered no more. With one mind, they plot together, they form an alliance against you. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagrites, Byblos, Ammon, and Amalek, Philistia, with the people of Tyre. Even Assyria has joined them to reinforce Lot's descendants. Do to them as you did to Midian, as you did to Sisera and Jabin at the river Kishon, who perished at Ender and became like dung on the ground. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, all their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, Let us take possession of the pasturelands of God. Make them like tumbleweed, my God, like chaff before the wind. As fire consumes the forest or a flame sets the mountains ablaze, so pursue them with your tempest and terrify them with your storm. Cover their faces with shame, Lord, so that they will seek your name. May they ever be ashamed and dismayed, may they perish in disgrace. Let them know that you, whose name is the Lord, that you alone are the Most High over all the earth. Now, let's take a look at a few key words from this chapter using Strong's Concordance. Enemies, the Hebrew word is, pronounced serer. It refers to foes or adversaries who are hostile or antagonistic. Plot, the Hebrew word is, pronounced chashub. It means to devise, plan, or scheme. Alliance, the Hebrew word is, pronounced beriath. It signifies a covenant, treaty, or agreement made between parties. Edom, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Edom. It refers to the descendants of Esau and denotes a region and people southeast of ancient Israel. Ishmaelites, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Yishmaeli. It signifies the descendants of Ishmael, son of Abraham, and is associated with Arab tribes. Moab, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Moab. It denotes a region and people east of ancient Israel, descendants of Lot. Hagrites, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Kogri. It refers to a people, possibly a tribe or group, with connections to the Hagrite clan. Byblos, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Jebel. It likely refers to the city of Byblos, an ancient Phoenician city in present-day Lebanon. Ammon, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Ammon. It denotes a region and people east of ancient Israel, descendants of Lot. Amalek, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Amalek. It refers to a people who were adversaries of the Israelites. Philistia, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Pelshit. It denotes the region of Philistia, an ancient region on the southwestern coast of ancient Israel. Tyre, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Seir. It refers to the city of Tyre, an ancient Phoenician city. Assyria, the Hebrew word is, pronounced Ashur. It denotes the ancient Assyrian Empire and people. Midian, the Hebrew word is.
In the United States today, there is a population of people who are the descendants of those who suffered through the time period mentioned in my last message. They are no longer a nation of people, but rather, they are a distinct people living in the land of their enslavers. They no longer have a remembrance of their language, names, customs, beliefs, or heritage, nor do they definitively know where their homeland is. They have been cut off from being a nation. Point out the similarities of this statement in comparison with Psalms chapter 83.
The statement you provided indeed highlights some striking similarities with the sentiments expressed in Psalm 83. Let's compare the statement with some key themes from Psalm 83. Descendants of suffering. The statement acknowledges that there is a population in the United States today who are descendants of those who suffered during the time period mentioned. Similarly, in Psalm 83, the psalmist talks about enemies who are conspiring against God's people and cherishing ill intentions towards them. No longer a nation, the statement mentions that this population is no longer a nation of people. Psalm 83 describes the enemy's desire to destroy Israel as a nation so that its name is remembered no more. Living in the land of enslavers, the statement notes that this population is living in the land of their enslavers. In Psalm 83, the enemies are described as forming an alliance against God's people, plotting together with a shared purpose. Loss of language, customs, and heritage. The statement acknowledges that the descendants no longer have a remembrance of their language, names, customs, beliefs, and heritage. In Psalm 83, the enemies are described as seeking to take possession of the pasturelands of God, suggesting an attempt to erase the identity and heritage of God's people. Uncertainty about homeland. The statement notes that the descendants do not know definitively where their homeland is. In Psalm 83, there is a clear sense of enemies seeking to obliterate the existence and memory of Israel's homeland and heritage. Cut off from being a nation, the statement implies that this population has been cut off from being a nation. Psalm 83 expresses the psalmist's plea for God to deal with the enemies in a manner that they will be ashamed, dismayed, and ultimately perish in disgrace. It's important to recognize that Psalm 83 is a historical psalm with a specific context, and different interpretations can exist regarding its application to specific modern-day situations. However, there are undeniable thematic similarities between the statement about descendants of suffering in the United States and the sentiments expressed in Psalm 83 concerning adversaries seeking to destroy a people and their heritage. These parallels may resonate with those who draw connections between biblical themes and historical experiences.
Let's examine Daniel chapter 9:24.
Certainly, let's examine Daniel 9 verse 24 from the Bible. Daniel 9 verse 24, New International Version. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. This verse is part of the prophecy given to the prophet Daniel, and it contains significant eschatological and messianic implications. Let's break it down and examine some key elements. 77s. The 77s refer to a period of time, often understood as 70 weeks or 70 sets of 7 years. This is a symbolic period, not literal weeks, and represents a specific time frame. Decree for your people and your holy city. This prophecy is specifically directed towards the people of Israel and their holy city, Jerusalem. To finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness. The prophecy speaks of the ultimate resolution of sin and wickedness, indicating a time when transgression will come to an end through divine intervention and atonement. To bring in everlasting righteousness. The prophecy foretells the establishment of an era of everlasting righteousness, suggesting a future time of divine rule and justice. To seal up vision and prophecy. This could mean that all divine visions and prophecies will be fulfilled and come to completion during this time. To anoint the most holy place. This refers to the consecration and anointing of the holiest place, which could have symbolic and spiritual significance. Interpreting Daniel 9 verse 24 and its subsequent verses can be complex, and interpretations have varied among religious traditions and scholars. Some interpret this prophecy as referring to the coming of the Messiah and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Others associate it with significant historical events in Jewish history. The verse holds deep significance for those who study eschatology and messianic prophecies, and it remains a subject of ongoing discussion and interpretation within various religious communities.
Break this verse down using the Strong Concordance.
Sure, let's break down Daniel 9 verse 24 using Strong's Concordance to understand the meanings of keywords in this verse. Daniel 9 verse 24, New International Version. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Now, let's examine some keywords in this verse using Strong's Concordance. 70, the Hebrew word is pronounced Shabuah. It refers to a period of 7, a week, or a heptad. In this context, it represents 70 sets of 7 years. Decreed, the Hebrew word is pronounced chadhak. It means to cut off or to determine, indicating that this period is divinely appointed or determined. Finish, the Hebrew word is pronounced kala. It signifies to complete, to bring to an end, or to consume. Transgression, the Hebrew word is pronounced pesha. It refers to rebellion, sin, or transgression against God's law. Put an end to, the Hebrew word is pronounced kala, the same word used for finish above. Sin, the Hebrew word is pronounced chada. It denotes sin, missing the mark, or falling short of God's standard. Atone for, the Hebrew word is pronounced kafar. It means to cover, to make atonement, or to pardon. Wickedness, the Hebrew word is pronounced aven. It refers to evil, wickedness, or iniquity. Bring in, the Hebrew word is pronounced bava. It means to enter, to bring, or to come in. Everlasting, the Hebrew word is pronounced olam. It signifies eternity, forever, or everlasting. Righteousness, the Hebrew word is pronounced tzedek. It denotes righteousness, justice, or moral rightness. Seal up, the Hebrew word is pronounced chatham. It means to seal, to shut up, or to close. Vision, the Hebrew word is pronounced shazan. It refers to a divine revelation, vision, or prophecy. Prophecy, the Hebrew word is pronounced nabi. It denotes a prophet or prophecy. Anoint, the Hebrew word is pronounced mashak. It means to anoint, often used in the context of consecrating someone or something for a special purpose. Most holy place, the Hebrew words are pronounced kodesh kodeshim. This phrase refers to the holiest place, typically within the context of the tabernacle or the temple. Using Strong's Concordance helps to gain deeper insights into the original Hebrew words used in the verse and their meanings, shedding light on the divine plan and the fulfillment of prophecy described in this significant biblical passage.
At this point, I need my viewers to pay very close attention to the next few questions. I believe that ChatGPT is about to reveal to you something that you might not have ever heard before. I am about to raise some questions about the 70th week of Daniel. ChatGPT has no reasoning skills. Therefore, this AI will have no other choice but to spit out the facts that are related to the questions being asked. So, if you're ready, let's get it. Let's examine Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. What can you tell me about this chapter and verse?
Certainly, let's examine Daniel 9 verse 24 from the Bible. Daniel 9 verse 24, New International Version. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. This verse is part of the prophecy given to the prophet Daniel, and it contains significant eschatological and messianic implications. Let's break it down and examine some key elements. 77s. The 77s refer to a period of time, often understood as 70 weeks or 70 sets of 7 years. This is a symbolic period, not literal weeks, and represents a specific time frame. Decree for your people and your holy city. This prophecy is specifically directed towards the people of Israel and their holy city, Jerusalem. To finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness. The prophecy speaks of the ultimate resolution of sin and wickedness, indicating a time when transgression will come to an end through divine intervention and atonement. To bring in everlasting righteousness. The prophecy foretells the establishment of an era of everlasting righteousness, suggesting a future time of divine rule and justice. To seal up vision and prophecy. This could mean that all divine visions and prophecies will be fulfilled and come to completion during this time. To anoint the most holy place. This refers to the consecration and anointing of the holiest place, which could have symbolic and spiritual significance. Interpreting Daniel 9 verse 24 and its subsequent verses can be complex, and interpretations have varied among religious traditions and scholars. Some interpret this prophecy as referring to the coming of the Messiah and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Others associate it with significant historical events in Jewish history. The verse holds deep significance for those who study eschatology and messianic prophecies, and it remains a subject of ongoing discussion and interpretation within various religious communities.
70 sets of 7 equates to 490 Jubilee years, or 9.8 Jubilees, just 2 weeks short of 10 Jubilees, or 500 years. How many weeks of years did Israel or Jeremiah serve in Babylon?
To calculate the number of weeks of years that Israel served in Babylon, we can refer to the historical context and scriptural references. According to the Bible, the Babylonian captivity, also known as the Babylonian exile, began in 586 BCE when King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the first temple. The captivity lasted for a period of 70 years, as prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah. Now, let's calculate the number of weeks of years. 1 week of years equals 7 years. 70 years, duration of the Babylonian captivity, divided by 7 years, 1 week of years equals 10 weeks of years. So, Israel served in Babylon for 10 weeks of years, which equates to 70 years. This aligns with the prophetic period foretold by Jeremiah and corresponds to the completion of 177s mentioned in Daniel 9 verse 24.
Now let's subtract 70 years from the total 490 years. That would leave 420 yet to serve in captivity. What does the Bible say about the last 7 years in the book of Revelation?
In the book of Revelation, the last 7 years are often referred to as the tribulation or the Great Tribulation. This period is described as a time of unprecedented turmoil, judgment, and divine intervention on earth. It is a central theme in eschatological, end times, interpretations within Christian theology. The book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse, is the final book of the New Testament and provides apocalyptic visions and prophecies about the end times. The concept of the last 7 years is primarily derived from passages like Daniel 9 verses 24 to 27, specifically Daniel 9 verse 27, which speaks of a future 70th week or a final 7-year period. This period is understood by many Christians to be the tribulation described in Revelation. The events during this time are believed to culminate in the return of Jesus Christ, the defeat of evil forces, and the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. During the 7-year tribulation, the book of Revelation describes various judgments and catastrophic events, such as the opening of the seals, the sounding of the trumpets, and the pouring out of the bowls. There are also references to the rise of the Antichrist, the sealing of the 144,000 servants of God, the 2 witnesses, and the Battle of Armageddon. Different Christian denominations and scholars have varying interpretations of the book of Revelation and its prophetic timeline. Some believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, where believers are taken up to heaven before the tribulation begins. Others hold to a mid-tribulation or post-tribulation rapture, where believers are taken up either in the middle or at the end of the 7-year period. It is essential to approach the interpretation of Revelation with humility and respect for diverse perspectives, as eschatological themes can be complex and multifaceted. The book of Revelation itself contains rich symbolism and imagery, and various interpretations have been proposed throughout history. Regardless of differing views, Christians generally agree on the overarching message of hope, redemption, and the ultimate triumph of God's purposes in the end times.
Let's subtract the 7 years related to the last days from the 420 years that are left for Israel to serve in captivity. That leaves us with 413 years remaining until the last 7 years begin in what is called the last days. Now, let's get back to the papal bull Dum Diversas. On what date was this papal bull enacted?
The papal bull Dum Diversas was enacted on June 18, 1452, by Pope Nicholas V. This bull granted the Portuguese monarch Alfonso V the authority to conquer and subjugate Saracens, Muslims, pagans, and other unbelievers and to claim their lands and properties. It was part of a series of papal bulls issued during the era of European exploration and colonial expansion, which aimed to justify and legitimize European conquest and colonization of non-Christian territories. The bull was instrumental in providing religious sanction for the expansion of European powers and the spread of Christianity during that period.
Now, let's add 413 years to June 18, 1452. What date do you come up with?
Adding 413 years to June 18, 1452, we get 1452 plus 413 is equal to 1865. Therefore, the date 413 years later would be June 18, 1865.
What is taking place in the United States on June 18th, starting in the year 1865?
June 18, 1865, is a significant date in United States history because it marks the beginning of several events related to the end of the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery. On June 19, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced General Order No. 3, which proclaimed the emancipation of all enslaved people in Texas. This event is now celebrated as Juneteenth, a holiday commemorating the emancipation of slaves in the United States. Although the official surrender of the Confederate Army occurred on April 9, 1865, with General Robert E. Lee surrendering to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, the last Confederate forces continued fighting for several more months. By June 18, 1865, most remaining Confederate forces had either surrendered or disbanded, effectively marking the end of the Civil War. With the end of the Civil War, the United States entered the Reconstruction era, a period of rebuilding and reuniting the nation. During this time, efforts were made to address the issues of civil rights, citizenship, and the integration of formerly enslaved people into society. It is essential to recognize that these historical events were complex and marked the beginning of a new chapter in American history. While the abolition of slavery was a significant milestone, the fight for civil rights and racial equality continued for many years, and the legacies of slavery and the Civil War still impact the United States today.
The so-called African Americans have endured and continue to show incredible resilience and strength as we navigate the path of history. We are the descendants of a people who faced unimaginable challenges, including kidnapping, captivity, and violence during the time of the Christian Crusade and the enactment of laws like Pope Nicholas V's Dum Diverses. This law targeted the people residing in the land now known as Africa. But in the face of adversity, hope shines brightly. According to Rudolph R. Windsor, there is a belief that those who resided on the west side of the African continent are the descendants of Israelites who fled from the land of Israel during tumultuous times. They sought safety and refuge, much like when Christ advised those in Jerusalem to flee when they see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. The journey of so-called African Americans and their heritage is a testament to courage and determination. Despite not being labeled as the lost tribes of Israel by the world, they seek understanding and connection to their roots that were violently stripped from their consciousness. Daniel's understanding of the 70 years of desolation in Jerusalem parallels the quest of those today who seek to learn about the lost tribes of Israel through historical research and ancient texts. One significant chapter in history that draws parallels to the promised blessings and curses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy is the transatlantic slave trade. This dark chapter echoes the past transgressions and sufferings, ultimately leading to a greater awakening and a path toward righteousness. In the last days, as the Most High God of Israel works to bring about reconciliation and everlasting righteousness, hope emerges through the promise of a righteous branch, a king who will execute judgment and justice. The days are coming when the children of Israel shall dwell safely, guided by the Lord our righteousness. The journey continues as descendants of Israel, including so-called African Americans, find solace and belonging in their heritage. They are no longer defined by their past as children of the formerly enslaved, but as Israel, being brought out of Egypt, as a people brought out from various countries, including the north. In their own land, they find their place and purpose, living with the spirit of resilience, hope, and the pursuit of justice and righteousness. The future is bright as so-called African American embrace their history, culture, and faith, creating a legacy of strength and unity for generations to come. While Israelites claimed their heritage from a table of liars, who feast on the truth, not knowing that the crumbs that fall from their table land into the hearts of a hungry people who are now waking up to a truth that the liars can no longer stomach. Daniel understood that Jeremiah's 70 years was 70 weeks of years, totaling 490 years of captivity, and that Jeremiah would serve 70 of those years, being held captive in Babylon. Today we understand that 7 of these years will be played out in the last days, when the Most High God of Israel redeems his people, leaving a total of 413 years of captivity. On June 18, 1452, when Pope Nicholas signed the papal bull, Dum Diverses. And on June 19, 1865, exactly 413 years, and a day later. Who in all of world history can fulfill the total number of years required by Daniel's calculations? How can we ignore the significance of this unbelievably hidden part of history? How many more crumbs of history do we need to fall off the table of those who feast on the truth in order to promote ignorance? Like Daniel, the Black Ancestry Network Group is seeking the books of the Most High, so that we too can reach an understanding, as did Daniel.